Kia ora, welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast, where we're going to be talking about social welfare, how to do it better. We're joined by Maxim researcher Thomas Scrimgeour. Welcome. How are you going?
Going well, thank you. Good to be here.
Well, you are very fortunate, very blessed, because this is a week where you have a paper on social impact bonds, and we'll get to that. But on this very week, the Social Investment Agency released about $50 million into a sort of policy area that we've had in our land before, but it's not been without controversy. We'll get to that. We'll get to that soon. But first off, we're talking about social impact bonds. You've just done a paper on it. What the hell is a social impact bond? Educate me.
It's a great question, Tim, because they're quite thorny and slightly complicated ways of structuring social policy. But essentially what they are is three players getting together in a room to think about how to execute social interventions. So if we take the example of mentoring for young men at risk of committing crimes, of offending. You've got the government who wants to, provide an intervention to fund something to help those people.
We want to help those people so we don't send them to prison and spend $180K a year punishing them. We need to. I think the phrase is the fence at the top of the cliff, not the ambulance at the bottom.
Absolutely. And so the government, has a number of things they could do. Perhaps super traditionally, the government could set up an agency to run an intervention themselves. Or alternatively, they could pay someone else to run an intervention. They could subcontract it. But what we're talking about with social impact bonds is a third way of doing things. So the government, as the ultimate funder of success, wants to buy an outcome. And so what they do is they find charities or social service providers who say, we think we can help this particular cohort of young men with youth support or mentoring or whatever the intervention is. And the government says, that's brilliant. You think you can change these people's lives? Back yourself, go find someone else to fund it, and if you succeed, we will pay for those outcomes. It's a performance-based contract for social interventions.
So this is almost social welfare entrepreneurship in some way.
Yeah, in many respects it is, in that it allows people to innovate is one of the key kind of aspirations we're having here, where there are different interventions that could be done. And so, providers can back themselves like an entrepreneur does.
And also, I guess this is from the ground up, right? So you're a provider. Ideally, you know the issue better than, say, someone sitting in a characterless tower somewhere. Just go, oh, okay, well, this sort of comes from our whiteboard session. It's got a lot more, I guess, localism to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the idea is that if you set up these contracts really well, you allow decision-making to be moved to the front line, because providers and their funders get to assess what they think is likely to be successful. The government only has to pay if the outcomes are achieved. But I think it's worth having a bit of empathy for the bureaucrat for a moment. And that, sometimes
I wasn't talking about a bureaucrat. How rude.
But when we think about, it's very easy to, bag on decision makers in Wellington who are detached from the issues on the ground. But they do actually face a really significant knowledge problem. You imagine you're not there on the ground seeing the issues day to day, but you're trying to decide what issues might work. And often we complain about compliance costs with interacting with government. But government does have a responsibility to ensure that the money they spend is delivered well. And so in a traditional framework, that means compliance and forms and KPIs and all of these things, ongoing reporting. But the idea is with a social impact bond is if you have clearly specified objectives at the start of the contract, you simply have to measure and report on those objectives, and the government doesn't have to micromanage all the other aspects.
Right, so the government basically says, here are your KPIs, someone else pays for it, and the provider goes and does it. If they reach the KPIs, they'll get the dough.
Absolutely. And so when we talk about KPIs, it's then worth asking the question, well, what KPIs and how do we decide how much money would be worth it for a bond?
And who determines that? I mean, it's not just the government. I guess the provider would say, hey, we think this is how this will work. I mean, as an investor too, you'd want to go, well, I have some skin in this game.
Yeah, so there are several pathways the government is looking towards. And so it's not set up yet, but one of the pathways further down the line they're looking at is what's called community commissioning, where sort of communities can make suggestions for the bonds and kind of have more agency in what they are. But that's kind of a little bit down the road. But I guess the thing that structures the bonds and sets the price point for them is really what we would call future liability to the government.
Right.
So these days, every interaction you have with the government, the data gets centralized in a single database called the IDI, Integrated Data Infrastructure. And this is slightly anonymized. Your name isn't in there as Tim Wilson. Your address isn't in there, but a sort of geolocated block is. So you're placed, but not specifically. The day of your birth...
Does it know that we just moved?
It will very quickly because the tax man always knows where you are.
That's
and
true.
then your day of birth is removed, but your month and year isn't. So in this database, they know what kind of person you are in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity, employment history, criminal history, but also say parents' criminal history and all such things. So because you have this data set, you can make projections about what certain categories of people are likely to experience over their life. And so this is probabilistic, it's to do with the population level, but you can begin to forecast, we expect people whose parents, who have a parent who has been imprisoned, are a certain percentage more likely to be imprisoned themselves because they have this background. So because we have these cohorts with these clearly defined challenges, we can then design interventions early to help them along the way.
Now, that's from, I guess, looking at the bottom of the cliff. There's also a wider picture here, which is that, for example, if you exclude national super, what do? We spend $25.5 billion a year on social security, social welfare, and we are facing structural deficits. Is that an imperative to do something like this? And if so, is it a good imperative? It's like, oh, we're running out of money. Do people make good decisions necessarily when they're running short on cash?
Yeah, so there are a range of factors you've identified there. So when you say a structural deficit, what that means is we're in a sort of a not quite or a quasi-recession at the moment, but even if economic growth returns strongly, we're still spending more than we're taking in. So the government books are a bit shaken up. And obviously there's the legacy of COVID. And the first time around when National started talking about these, it was the legacy of the Christchurch earthquake, put a lot of pressure on the government books.
Oh, plus the GFC.
Plus the GFC, right? These back-to-back kind of catastrophic events really did create pressures for the government. But there'll always be pressures that the government faces. But the bigger...
and necessity is the mother of invention, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad outcome.
Yeah, and so, but the bigger challenge is if we do spend such a large amount of money, and there will always be debates, should it be more, should it be less? But the challenge is, I think, we can't always say just spending more is enough. Often that's the way you show, I'm the one who cares because I want to make the number in the budget line bigger. The other person over there doesn't. It's just a competition to who can raise the number on the budget line. But how do we have the tools that allow us to say, actually, what we're spending is getting the outcomes we want. We're not just spending more.
So, in a sense, what we're arguing for, or what social impact bonds are saying they'll provide, is a better social welfare system, not necessarily a more expensive one.
Absolutely. I think the price point, how much we should spend on social welfare is another conversation that needs to be had. But the promise of a social impact bond is that whatever we do spend, we get more value for money out of it.
Now, here's the issue, though. It's what happens when these things fail? I mean, they can fail. They have failed before. Aren't we left high and dry?
So that's a really important feature of the social impact bond, is that when we think about helping people and trying new things, if we're really going to push the envelope and actually really try new ways of helping people, some things will fail. And that's just really important because if we're too scared of failure, we will never do anything. So the promise of a...
That's true. We wouldn't have done this podcast if we were afraid of failure.
Exactly. So the promise of a social impact bond is that the government pays for success, not for failure. And so it is up to service providers to convince funders to provide the money up front. And if success is achieved, the funders get their payout. If it fails, then it's the funders who bear the risk of it. So the promise is that risk is outsourced from the government.
So if I come up with a social impact bond platform, opportunity, program, where would the money come from? From the government or, well, no, not from the government, obviously from the investor.
Yeah,
so who are the investors?
From the first trial we had that really got all the way to completion was with the Genesis Youth Trust. And so they had big institutional investors. So ANZ Bank wasn't funding them, but they helped them manage the financial side. So they were there. But it was the New Zealand Super Fund was the biggest player. So, the fund the government has set up to help us fund retirement savings invested. And then a few other big institutional investors got involved as well. So for these trial bonds, it wasn't mum and dad investors or individual people, it was these institutions. But that's not necessarily how it has to be.
Right.
There's a range of ways you could seek funding for them.
And let's talk a bit about the Genesis Trust, because that's that, from my understanding, having read your paper, that went very well. So tell me a bit about it and how it went well.
So around about 2016, the government was looking at setting up some trial impact bonds. So very small scale relative to the wider social intervention portfolio, but to test the concept. And so the one that succeeded and went all the way through to completion was done with Genesis Youth Trust in Auckland. So essentially that was a program that was designed to provide wraparound support for young people at risk of offending. And so essentially what they did was Genesis Youth Trust were the intervention providers, counselling, mentoring, all of those interventions you'd expect.
And they'd been in this area before, right?
Yeah, so they were already operating in this area. This was a new way to help fund their work and allow them to scale, and providing them with more stability over time because it provided a longer time horizon. And so what they did was they got an investment from the super fund and a few other investors, and they set up this bond, and it ran for 6 years. And at the end of those 6 years, they saw what were the outcomes. And because at the start of the process, you say, we have an expected reoffending rate for these young people. And so then after 6 years, what they found was that there was a 30% reduction. So for people who completed the program, they were 30% less likely to find themselves committing a crime that led to a conviction than those who hadn't completed the program, then the baseline case. And so it was very successful. It wrapped up in 2023, and there was this big review report to see what did we learn, what were the outcomes. And essentially when they tried to calculate a social value for every dollar spent on the program, $9 of social value was created. So a very, very positive outcome overall.
Wow. That sounds impressive. And it's all wrapped up, so they didn't continue it? Yeah,
absolutely. So these were trial bonds. So Genesis Youth Trust was the one that ran to completion.
Sort of like a prototype in some ways.
Absolutely. But the Labour government that succeeded, National, it's not something they were super keen on continuing. So they allowed it to run to completion. They didn't shut it down, but they also didn't set up any new ones or keep investing in this approach. So Genesis Youth Trust wrapped up, and there was sort of nothing else occurring in this space.
Right. And just in terms of the political spectrum, this is the notion of making social welfare deliver more efficiently. That was something actually, as I understand it, you mentioned in your paper, started by, a mode that Sir Michael Cullen began under the Helen Clark government.
Yeah, well, I mean, at one level, the idea that government spending should be efficient goes back 100 years. I mean, in my paper, I start with a quote from an American economist who was looking at New Zealand public policy in 1909. He basically argues that it would be an invention greater than a flying machine to provide an accounting system to measure the efficiency of public services. Like, it's something that we've
And this was even before there were flying machines.
Exactly. So it's always been the case that people who have been spending government money have wanted to find ways to make it more effective. But I think Michael Cullen really did, lead a series of reforms within the public service, trying to get better data. And because in the modern world, with a digitized world, it's easier to pull data from different sources and link them together. So it's a technological innovation in that we do have centralized data we can manage now. But then also there's a political one as well. And so I don't think it needs to be locked into a left-right binary that various political figures have tried to use these sort of measures.
However, if there was, obviously, if this policy is used, there needs to be some agreement that, okay, if the next government comes in, they're not going to scrap it. Then some kind of sort of democratic continuity, for want of a better word.
Absolutely. And it's not just the risk of scrapping it. Like, I'd suspect that's not a high risk, that whatever is established will be allowed to run its course, like the Genesis Youth Trust. But really with these sort of processes, you want the efficiency gained by regular iteration of it, that it's really over
The
time.
more you do it, the better you get at it.
Exactly. So the sort of in manufacturing, what you call the nth of a kind. The first one is really complicated and expensive. You build a second thing, it gets a bit easier, and by the time you're doing sort of a limitless number of these things, you find these efficiencies. And so if social impact bonds become embedded over time, we should be able to get really good at creating them, getting funding for them, and allowing them to run. But the risk is that if they just get put on ice, that then the investment market just isn't interested because they don't think it's going somewhere.
Yeah. And also you get what happened as well with one of the first trials, because one succeeded, we mentioned Genesis, but Wise Group social impact bond collapsed during negotiation, cost $1.62 million. Any lessons there? Why did that happen? What can we take away?
Yeah, so the government at the time was looking to set up some social impact bonds and trying a few different things. So one that failed was sort of a mental health intervention. They got into some negotiations. You spend a bunch of money on people's time and trying to set something up, and it just didn't go anywhere. They couldn't reach an agreement. It's never been fully publicly clear what the sticking point was, but it failed. It was dead on arrival. So they didn't start delivering services, but they spent a reasonable amount of money, over $1.5 million trying to do something, and it failed. And so that, for certain critics, says, hey, look, we spent a bunch of money and it wasn't worth it. Which is why it's really important to look at these things as a whole. That if you look at the costs of the failed bond and of the successful one.
So you put Genesis with the with Wise Group.
Yep, you put all of their costs.
And then you get the number.
Yeah, and then you show the benefits of the Genesis bond. It's still worth it. You do have to include all of those costs. But I think it's actually really important that failure is a possibility for these things. When we think about
the power of failure.
The power of failure, because one, that shows you're really trying something. If you never failed, you're not trying to do anything new or challenging. But also there's this idea of creative destruction, right? There are some things that work really well, but then they become obsolete, right? When we think about private markets, things don't always last forever. New and better things come along. And so it's a real thing we have to account for, but actually the fact that some of these don't get off the ground isn't a problem. It shows you're trying new things. You just have to measure all of the costs against all of the benefits.
Okay, so you've written a paper on this, all of the costs, all of the benefits. What recommendations do you have for this season of social impact bonds?
So the first is a recommendation that is just reiterating what the government did really right the last time. We mentioned that Wise Group bond failed. There were some calls at the time in the media, we really want these bonds to succeed. Perhaps for the first couple, the government should underwrite the risk, just to make sure they really, really succeed. And that sort of undermines the key feature of these, is that risk.
I would say this is, the risk isn't outsourced. It's kept in-house. And so you're not actually creating something innovative.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my recommendation is just to the government to hold the line on this. If you're going to do this...
Wait, what? You're saying don't spend any money?
What I'm saying is that you have to be willing to realize that these might fail. If you don't have the courage to see that they might fail, you don't believe in the approach. And so it really is that discipline of government. But the other thing, I think, is just to realize... that social welfare is inherently political. These use big data. They're trying to find more efficient ways of doing things.
And there will be privacy concerns alleviated.
Yeah, so we could get to that in terms of charities. But even when we think about what the government does, if we think about the way big data could show us what rehabilitation could do. Rehabilitation is a really good thing. It's a thing our criminal justice system does. But it's not the only thing our criminal justice system does. One of the things that happens is that people who commit crimes are convicted, and part of the punishment for that, in terms of going to prison, is punishment. There's a punitive element to this. And if people want to move to a rehabilitation-only approach, they could argue for that, but it has to be something that happens in the democratic debate, not the technocrats who have their social investment or social impact bond who then decide this is the best way. So we still need to have a political framework for deciding what sort of things might get funded.
That's when I think it's one of the discontents of our technocratic age is people who aren't technocrats often feel that they're spoken down to, or that they have less control over their lives and that's also erodes democratic process as well. So what you're saying is, if the people don't like it, they'll vote it out, or that politically there'll be a price for this, and that's the way it should be.
Absolutely. And so I think, we've got an election coming up next year. And if the current government is really keen to see these grow and flourish, they need to put them front and center of any political messaging they have. They have to be able to say, we're not just doing this because we think it's a good idea. We've gone to the New Zealand public and said, this is what we believe in. And they've backed us, because that democratic legitimacy allows things to endure.
So what you're saying to the government is you have to have the courage to actually allow things to fail, and also it has to be democratically run, not technocratically run. Okay, I'm all about the rule of threes. What's the last thing you suggest that should be done with these? And we'll start to wrap it up.
Well, to push the boat out a little bit, as these are currently structured, we call them a social impact bond, but they don't really function like a bond does in the private market. It's a three-way contract between three defined parties, and that's who's involved. When these were first proposed, and it was actually by a New Zealand economist in the 80s, they were imagined more as a tradable bond.
Oh, so, like a share.
Essentially. So if you think about the upfront funders have committed to fund a project because they believe in it. Things change over time. They have given their upfront funding, but haven't yet received their payout. There will be a degree of uncertainty about whether or not it's going to succeed. What they should be able to do to make it more like a bond is to be able to on-sell their contract to another buyer. So if the contract is worth $10 million for success, and 3 years into a 6-year contract, they're either a bit financially tight or a bit unsure, they should be able to on-sell that for $4 million. There's a bit of uncertainty there. They're trying to reclaim some of their things, but someone else who believes more in it says, I think this will still achieve.
Or someone else who has an innovative idea can then go, okay, well, you know what, I'll put my money behind this.
So that doesn't change what the social service delivering the project does, but it allows for more price discovery. Because one of the key features of this is that creating a market for it allows the government to see, well, what do other people think is the likelihood of success? Because if you don't have tradability, you don't see what success is until you've finished the project, contracts have been paid out. So it takes a sort of 6 to 10 years to see, have we really learned anything? But if you have a tradable secondary market, price discovery arrives faster.
Because markets are mechanisms for information to be transferred.
Absolutely. And when we think about decision making, information that is relevant is everywhere and no one has all of it. So the role prices have, both in markets and in social impact bonds, is these prices say, what do people generally think is true, even if we can't see why? So pushing the boat out a bit, if they could create a pathway to tradability, these could be even more interesting.
So you've heard about the NZSX, maybe it's the NZSIS, so to speak. Oh, wait, that sounds like completely different, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Thomas. And the paper is available on the Maxim website, www.maxim.org.nz. Sign up. We'll send you emails about what we've been interested in. You could also subscribe to this podcast series. You'll get more content like this. And look, we're a charity, so if you donate, we'll be able to do more great work like this. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Ka kite.